So I'll slowly get the show going. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. Welcome to this LSE hybrid event hosted by both the European Institute and the School of Public Policy. I'm Kristen Surak. I'm an associate professor of political sociology here at the LSE, and I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by Ian Goldin to mark the launch of his new book, The Shortest History of Migration. Before we get going, though, I'll give that standard caveat to ask you to put your phones on silent, if you could, to keep that from potentially disrupting the event. There'll also be a chance for Q&A afterwards, also for the people who are joining online, and I understand that we have also very expansive attendance online. We can accept questions through the chat function as well. But all that aside, I'd like to first introduce our guest for tonight. So Ian Goldin is Oxford University Professor of Globalisation and Development, as well as the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, which is the world's leading center for interdisciplinary research on critical global challenges. And even before this event, Ian was describing to me some of the incredible initiatives that they've been undertaking there. And he was the person who made it all happen in the first place. He has an incredible resume, and I'll just hit a couple of the highlights. He's been vice president for the World Bank. He's been knighted by the French government, and he's also written and produced 3 series for the BBC. He's written an incredible number of books that can pretty much put any academic to shame. He's got over 25 titles to his name, including very famous works like The Planet is Full, Divided Nations, The Butterfly Effect, The Age of No City, which is one of the best books of the year, according to the Financial Times. And so it's an incredible pleasure to be able to both introduce and discuss his most recent work, The Shortest History of Migration, which I'll let you know is not an easy thing to do, to cover in about 220 pages, basically the history of Homo sapiens and the people as people on the move. But he does this in incredible fashion, covering, both the world, across time and across space, as well as hitting on a lot of the key topics that remain quite relevant today. So without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Ian to discuss what he's written for us in terms of migration. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kristen, for that very generous introduction. To all of you for coming, and to all of those that are online for joining. This is a coming home for me. I was a student at LSE a long time ago, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And every time I come back, there's a new building to discover, a new place, and that's just incredible. It's a tribute to LSE and what it's achieved, not only in terms of its alumni, but being able to raise the funds to expand and to do ever greater things. What I hope to be able to share with you in about 30 minutes, and then Kristen and I will have a conversation and we'll open it up, is some of the ideas that led me to do this book and the takeaways that I have from it. But clearly, trying to summarize the 300,000-year history of migration in 30 minutes means I'll be covering, maybe 10,000 years a second. So it's a very, very rapid. The story is one that I'm attempting to tell because I'm so convinced that migration is the source of human progress, the source of civilizational progress, of innovation, and that the way that this migration story is told today and is perceived in the popular imagination and in politics is really wrong. Is wrong both because it's factually wrong, but it's wrong because the political consequences of that misunderstanding are leading, I think, to very negative outcomes, not only for the migrants themselves, their families and dependents, for the countries they leave, the countries they go to, and for the future of humanity. And that's why I told the story. It's my second attempt to tell the story in this way. I had another book in 2014 called Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future. It was a Princeton University Press, more academic book. And it clearly failed because things in the popular imagination have just got worse since then. This is a less academic book. It's a more broad, sweeping book in terms of its coverage. But it's essentially trying to unpack some of the things. But I've discovered a lot since I did that previous book. And amongst the things I've discovered and continue to discover is how rapidly our understanding of migration is evolving. Just while I was doing the book, over the past 18 months or so, our knowledge of the origins of humanity and of migration have transformed dramatically. In the last week, you might have picked up that Christopher Columbus was not actually a Portuguese Christian explorer, but a Jewish Spaniard. And that's just from DNA analysis of some remains that have been found of him from a tomb where parts of him were encast. But thinking about the early history of humanity, and now I'm talking about where do we come from, that has evolved very rapidly too. When I started the book, the consensus was that it was in East Africa about 200,000 years ago. By the time I finished the book, the consensus had moved to actually Morocco and more Northwest Africa about 300,000 years ago. So there's enormous uncertainty. And I'm sure that in the next year, we'll discover more things. And that's really mainly as a result of the extraordinary progress that's happening in genomics and DNA sequencing, the ability to find from fragments that are left and buried, found by archaeologists, much more about where we come. But over this period of about 300,000 years ago till about 90,000 years ago, we were basically all Africans, moving around in Africa, some interbreeding happening across Africa, but very little movement outside Africa. Outside Africa, there were other species. There were the Neanderthals in Europe, the Denisovans in Asia, who were thriving in different ways. We left Africa about 95,000 years ago, crossing to what's now the Arabian Peninsulas and where the Suez Canal is now, and began to penetrate different parts of the world. If we hadn't done that, and particularly if we hadn't left the places that had been our original heartlands in Africa, we probably would have died out as a species. So it was that movement, both because of the famines and the droughts that were happening in Africa, the propulsion, but also where we ended up was with interbreeding with the other species, with the Neanderthals in Europe and the Denisovans in Asia. And so we're pretty mixed up. There are some parts of humanity who are more purer, like humanity used to be in the 90,000 years ago, and they mainly the groups that live in the southwest part of Africa, the Khoisan people and others, who have less trace of Neanderthal or Denisovan in them. They still have some, but they have less trace than we've got in the rest of the world. One of the remarkable things is the great mysteries that remain is how people got to where they got to. We know that people were in Australia by 45,000 years ago, long before we have any recorded evidence of canoes or rafts or other means of seafaring transport. And of course, one of the questions is, how do they get there? And by 25,000 years ago, we were in South America. We crossed the Virunga Straits between Alaska and Siberia, moved down Africa and into South America. And there's trace of people being in South America up to 25,000 years ago. That's also contested. Even the route is contested. There are some books that have been written about actually people got to the Americas by moving from Europe across the Atlantic, not through Siberia. Well, I think that's sort of weaker theory at the moment. Remember that from about 45,000 years ago to about 20,000 years ago, we had a massive ice age. And so there was a lot of water held on land above ice, and oceans were much lower than they were today. Some estimates are 25 meters to 50 meters lower than they are today, which means that there were parts which are now submerged by ocean, including connecting pieces towards Australia, or not the whole way, certainly across in the Americas and around the Indus Plateau, where people could walk and move in ways that they cannot today. And there were also big ice bridges around the world. And that's how people, most of the theories around how people got into the Americas is the ice bridge across what is now the Bering Strait into the Americas. But it's very difficult also to work out exactly how people did it, because ice bridge means it was very cold and it took a long time to walk, and people didn't really have clothing as we know it today. So, you know, the big mysteries remain. How do people survive for that long and move for that long in numbers to end up where they end? So a lot of mystery in human migration. But what is clear is that these people that moved took with them ideas and took with them food and took with them technologies that they then embraced in the new places in new ways. And one of the ways we can understand early human migration is by understanding the movement of plants and animals around the world. Domesticated animals didn't really exist yet, but rats and animals like that did and were taken by people, but particularly plants. And it's through the genetic coding on plants that we're beginning to understand more about human migration, because we know the plants didn't come from those places and then the seeds just didn't sort of wash across the ocean. They were transferred and taken to these places. And so a lot is coming out from botanists and others understanding the genomic sequencing and the origins and crossbreeding of plants that are related. There's also a lot of linguistic evidence that's emerging as AI is helping with the decoding of linguistic roots. And for example, all the languages around the Pacific have commonalities, which makes people feel that people basically ventured out from Japan and other places into the islands around. So we are piecing together pieces of a puzzle, but there are lots and lots of empty parts to it. How many people migrated? What share of people was then? Why did people migrate? Remains, of course, a big mystery. We know that migrants were very brave people, that they endured enormous hardship, that often they went because they were propelled to. In other words, the places they left were no longer hospitable to them because of a famine or because of a drought. We know people were propelled by conflict, but we also know that people were propelled to move out of exploratory spirit, out of curiosity. What's over that mountain? What's over that sea? Where are those birds going to when they move away? Those sorts of questions were asked by people, and they followed their curiosity. People were also propelled by just wanting to establish themselves differently. They didn't like their parents-in-law, and they decided they wanted to go elsewhere. That sort of propulsion drove people then, I believe, as it does today. So the peopling of the planet by about 25,000 years ago was pretty complete, in that there were people everywhere on all the main continents. And then as people started moving after that, they started bumping into each other again. So, you know, these terms about the Americas being discovered in the 1500s, of course, are complete nonsense, because people had been there for a very, very long time. But this bumping into each other again happened with increasing frequency. And it's that, when that started happening, that you get leapfrogging in technological progress. Because ideas that had been gradually evolved in one place suddenly get brought to another place. How to manage fire and cook, about 6,000 years ago, how to domesticate horses and ride them. About 4,000 years ago, how to use the wheel, for example. These were all ideas brought by migrants and transferred by migrants from one place to another. And so places that had taken tens of thousands of years to evolve a technology suddenly were able to share it with other places very, very rapidly. It's that sharing, that pollination, that ability to bring ideas evolved in one place to another, which to me is at the heart of why migration is such a progressive force. It's because people move, not only do they escape death, do they escape persecution, do they escape many bad things, but they bring with them the ideas embedded in their cultures, in their technologies, in their ways of doing things, which are totally different to those of the places they come to. And that pollination of the old and the new from a place is what gives us massive leaps in progress. Of course, it's given us everything we have in the UK, not only because we are very fundamentally an island composed of people that have come from elsewhere, but the technologies we use are all from elsewhere as well. India is not given enough credit generally. I mean, the source of mathematics, there would be no computers without the mathematical system of 0-1 developed in India, for example. The concept of zero was developed there. And although people talk a lot about other technological progress, it's these fundamental abilities around alphabet, around numerics, around an understanding of space and time, which are so fundamental to what makes us human. The interbreeding that occurred also propelled our progress. For example, the interbreeding with Denisovans allowed us to be lactose tolerant. In other words, that was very important when we began to domesticate animals with milk and so on, but it also allowed us to live at different altitudes because they had been living at much higher altitudes than Homo sapiens had ever lived at prior to that. So the ability to absorb oxygen at altitude was one of the traits that we got from them. Neanderthals probably gave us much of our brain. People say as an insult, oh, that person's a Neanderthal. It's probably a compliment because they had bigger brains than we had. Why they died out and we didn't is one of the mysteries. And there's lots of different books written about this, lots of explanations. But one of the theories is that Homo sapiens was more social, was more able to operate cooperatively and in networks. And this is, of course, contrary to one of the theories around Homo sapiens is that we're killing species. But the evidence seems to suggest that we were able to cooperate and work in groups and learn and adapt more quickly. And I think that that's a convincing story until someone comes up with a better one as to why we survived and Neanderthals didn't. Just fast forwarding then very, very rapidly, people move, people multiply, and of course it's the development of cities particularly, and the commerce between cities that drives this very phenomenally rapid growth in incomes that occurs. So most of human history, people are very poor, very subsistence everywhere. And then suddenly we see some places being able to develop specialization, expertise through concentration, but mainly driven by the ability to produce agricultural surpluses. It wasn't until agriculture became productive enough to create a surplus, in other words, more product than an individual that made the product on the land consumed, that people could specialize, that you could have non-agricultural people in society, specialists in different things, that you could develop armies, that you could develop the capacity to specialize. And it was a specialization that you get the turbocharging of innovation. When people did repetitive tasks that weren't and were able to spend more of their brain time and more of their time developing things other than on the land, simply agricultural production, that you see this virtuous circle developing of city growth, of specialization, cooperation, innovation, and income growth coming from it. It's then when, of course, you begin to get income differentials as well, and commerce between places, extremely important. We don't know much about early commerce, but there are remarkable findings which help us understand that 6,000, 7,000 years ago, people were trading over vast distances, found through shells and other things that were used as tokens of exchange at very far away places, but also coins. And massive, massive trade between, for example, the Romans and India, with hordes of coins. And this is so India was running a surplus, a trade surplus, basically, with the Roman Empire. And we know that because they were just accumulating more and more and more coins. They exported much more to the Roman Empire than they wanted from the Romans. And that's reflected in what's been found all around the Indian ports in terms of the coinage. By the time we move into the period of a couple of thousand of years ago, we're into a world where migration is no longer simply what individuals choose to do or go, but increasingly propelled by states, which begin to develop. So we have armies, we have colonization, we have extreme wealth and slavery begins to develop. The word Slav, of course, derived from Slavic people. They were amongst the first slaves. The word chow, for example, is also derived from I'm your slave. So that system, which developed mainly between Europe and Eastern Europe, what's now Eastern Europe and the Baltics, is where we begin to see mass slavery. Not on the scale that then happened much later, from the 1500s, of course, in Africa. But cumulatively over time, one of the surprises I found is that there was probably more people traded over as slaves over the Indian Ocean than over the Atlantic Ocean, over the whole of history. But what was different about the Atlantic slave trade was, of course, that it was over a short period of time and it was industrial scale of barbaric proportions. About 10 million people were forcibly moved and made the passage across the Atlantic, mostly first to what's now Brazil and the Caribbean, mainly for sugar production, but later cotton and other products. About 4 million people died resisting capture, and about 2.5 million people died in passage. So the scale of this barbarism is unimaginable. Average life expectancy of the slaves was 7 years. When they got there, they were literally worked to death. So the scale of that is, I think, the greatest forced dislocation of people. But it's something which highlights the point that migration should not only be thought of as a positive thing. Clearly, this was a barbaric thing, a horrendous thing. And so I'm careful not to say migration is always good, because clearly it's many times terrible and is the source of great injustices. By the time slavery is abolished in the 1850s, and we get indentured labor, which is new bonded labor, and similar numbers of people are forced into indentured labor, but on some sort of legal contract. Often it's a debt contract, so we will pay your passage on condition you work for a certain amount of time. We will give you something in return, and comes out of the levels of desperation of people, particularly in the Indian and Malay and other parts of the world. that eventually gives way to other forms of contractual labor. And in the process, we see the increased number of people moving voluntarily, willingly, but under contract, and then often not being able to return because they're indebted. And that balance between who pays for your voyage, how is it financed, can you get home, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand in the statistics. Over this whole period of time, very few people would be called migrants in today's classification. And one of the things I grappled with in doing the book was trying to understand, what do we mean by migrant? Remember that borders as we know them today, passports as we know them today, the data gathering that we know today is a very new invention. It really only started being developed around the First World War. In the book, I tell the stories taken from great novels and others of people when they first encounter a passport officer who asks for their passport, their utter surprise, as recently as 1914, for example. They literally don't know what people are talking about when they talk about passports and that sort of thing. So it's a new invention. And of course, before that, and the data gathering is new. So the scale of what was happening, the control of it, it's really the development of nation states and the First World War that crystallizes migration as we think about it today, which is the control of people over national borders. Now, there are about 100 new countries since then, or more, I think 150 new countries since the First World War, which begs the question as to if we define migration as the movement across national borders, the same people that used to go within their own country now are called migrants. And we see this in the numbers. From the period that we begin to be able to tell how many people there are, because there's beginning to be statistics, border controls, it seems like about 3% of people in societies are migrants. This number is relatively constant over time. In other words, 97% of people stay put, decide not to migrate. About 3% of people go, and this is not talking about the slavery period and the mass migration. This is since the First World War, where we have these numbers. And the growth in migration, therefore, is really a reflection of the growth in the world's population. Because there are so many more countries, about 150 more countries than there were at the First World War, we would expect migrant numbers actually to be much higher. We'd expect this share to be much bigger. And the remarkable thing is that it hasn't grown more significantly over time. One of the interesting experiments, and I'm conscious of the fact that this event is co-hosted by the School of Public Policy and the European Institute, is that Europe is a wonderful example. It's the only example we have in this post-First World War period of countries willingly removing border controls in a dramatic way. So within the 30 countries of Schengen, I mean, there's some now smaller controls, big short-term controls in Germany, but basically within the 30 Schengen countries, that's the European Union, 27 plus 3, one can have free movement of people within this zone. I've just cycled from the north to the south of Portugal across the Spanish border 11 times. And I didn't know when I was in Spain or in Portugal. The only way I'd know was that my Garmin, my bicycle computer would change time zones because Spain is on Central European time and Portugal is on the same time zone as Britain. That is a most remarkable thing. And it speaks to the construct of borders, but also it speaks to this question of what happens if you remove borders. Do people all go to the high-income places or to the places with better social security, whatever else is alleged? And of course, the answer is no. And we see this in the financial crisis of 2008 to 10 in Europe, where you had towns in the south of Greece and Portugal and Spain, where you had 80% youth unemployment, and people did not leave. They did not go elsewhere because they stayed with their families and because in dire times, their communities supported them. Now, over time, the biggest period of migration, and I focus on this to some extent in the book, is the age of mass migration from about 1850 to the First World War. Huge numbers of people moved. About 30% of Europeans moved. I mean, these are very large numbers. About 50% of the Irish population moved. The Irish population today, at about 5.5 million in Ireland and about 1.5 in Northern Ireland, is still much smaller today than it was in 1850 when it was over 8 million people. And this out-migration, obviously propelled by famine, by brutality of British rule in Ireland, was not totally uncommon to what was going on elsewhere. Half of the south of Italians moved. A third of the Scandinavians moved. These and mass movements a bit later, which was my grandparents, out of what's now the Baltics, propelled by the pogroms, by the attacks on Jewish people, for example, in that period, where you'd have millions of people moving and going around the world. That propulsion, which was a propulsion driven by need, by survival, of course, has led to the peopling of many places today. At the same time, the development of the US, for example, and of Canada was also a mass attraction. So in the book, I talk about the recruitment policies, for example, of many places who were desperate for labor and very competitive for labor. From the Industrial Revolution and on, in terms of the demand, different types of labor, seasonal labor for agriculture, but also industrial manufacturing labor, labor to build railways, etc. The First World War was the first mass mobilization of armies. Over half the people in the war were not from Europe. They were brought from the colonies, from the imperial colonies. And one of the sad stories is how little is talked about this. This also happened in the Second World War. In fact, about a third of the troops in France that were fighting were Black. And Gary Young has written a great piece about how they were basically literally whitewashed out of history. De Gaulle, Churchill, and Roosevelt conspired to make sure there would not be Black faces entering Paris in 1945. And Black people were confined to barracks, and white people were shipped in from all over to make this look like white armies saving Europe. But this role of people, and the very different roles that are being played, is the story that I tell in the book. Fast forwarding to the post-Second World War period, we have a very different type of structure in the international migration regime. We have increasing control. We have increasing dispossession of colonies and imperial rule, and increasingly massive demand in the golden age of capitalism, the period about 1945 to the mid-70s, of demand for labor. And we get this recruitment of people, as we see in the Windrush generation and elsewhere, to basically staff the services of the old imperial powers on all sorts of false promises. That is one of the legacies that we are living through today. People attracted to live in the old imperial power, as they had been attracted to fight for them in the war, on the basis of false promises. The international migration regime today is one of extreme unevenness. There's no data. So if one is asked how many migrants are there in the world, these are best guesses. There's no matching of import and export, in the sense that countries report their number of nationals somewhere else have no relationship to the number of reported by the country that they are in. So, for example, even a relatively small population group like the Bulgarians in Britain, the Bulgarians say there are 200,000 less Bulgarians in Britain than the British say they are. So very big mismatches. And this is partly the result that many countries, including the UK, don't count people leaving. They only count people entering. It's also because there's a lot of undocumented workers. In the US, the estimate is at least 14 million people are undocumented. It's also the case that all the countries don't have the same definition of migrants. So in the UK, for example, we count students as migrants, but some other countries don't. Do we count people as migrants if they come for a day, or only if they come for 6 months or a year? Do we count the tourists as migrants? And so on. These are all subjective national decisions. There's no uniform global agreement on this. There are attempts at it, but it's the statistics are at best uncertain, and the counting is, which is why it can be weaponized in the way it is. My own view is that the current anti-immigration sentiment is really a disconnect between the economics and the politics, that there is very little evidence economically for the sorts of arguments that are being made by people who are virulently anti-immigrant. Immigrants basically create jobs, they lift wages, they contribute positively to the exchequer, and in the short term and in the medium and long term, they are the source of dynamism in societies. They are at least double what one would expect as their share of the population in terms of small business creation, in terms of patents, in terms of innovation, etc. In other words, they are the source of productivity growth within societies and innovation. We need to distinguish extremely clearly in our minds between economic migrants and other forms of migrants that come on a voluntary basis or a contractual basis or coming to study, and refugees. Refugees are a particular category of migrants who fall under international law. There's very clear law around who is a refugee and what qualifies as a refugee, legitimate fear of persecution or for their lives. And the conflation of the two is a source of, I believe, great problems, not least in the UK. The people coming on small boats are not economic migrants or students, they are refugees. The UK is absolutely scandalous in its lack of providing safe passage to migrants by forcing people through illegal channels into criminal gangs, etc. And it would rank about number 20 out of the 27 countries in Europe in terms of its accepting of refugees. So we accept about 12 people per 10,000 citizens, and that is very, very low by global and European standards. 95% of refugees end up in neighboring countries. It's Jordan, Turkey, for example, Lebanon, who are the main recipients. Many of the refugee problems we face are the result of bad decisions in the past. Amongst the most strange decisions, of course, are the 1947 decisions to basically carve up the countries. The carving up of India with Pakistan by Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been east of Paris in his life, a British barrister deciding to create a new country, is one such thing which led to a mass movement and refugees of over 10 million people, maybe 2 million people killed as a result of that. And of course, the other legacy of 1947 is the Gaza-Israel and the creation of a place, of a state where there had been other people, Arabs living, who are now permanent refugees and under UNRWA. So these are all aspects of of the refugee regime and the failure to manage it effectively in the past, which I believe are very different to the migration regime. And it's migration that I believe is a much more positive, if properly managed, aspect of the story. But I think I've spoken for long enough. I look forward to the conversation with Kristen and then discussion with all of you.
Thanks very much. Let's see if these are who appear to be working. So as you'll probably have gotten a sense from the discussion just now, the book covers a lot of territory. Basically telling the history of the world and bringing in what's really quite impressive, a lot of details, a lot of different angles, and some of which is really turning on its head a lot of common sense assumptions about international migration. So in thinking about the vast breadth of this book, what is the relationship between Homo sapiens walking across the Bering Straits and incredibly cold weather with refugee in forced migration, in slavery, etc. today? So thinking about the mobility of the ancient world versus then what goes on in say the modern world, say 1500 to the present, to even now, would you say, in thinking about this, should we be moving to a world of no borders? What things look like perhaps, 50,000, 10,000 years ago?
I think if part of me says if I say that, people think I've been smoking something. Good. Because it seems like such an idealistic, fantastical notion. But we do have the example of the European Union, which is a group of 30 countries which have made exactly that decision. So it's not so fantastical. And as far as I know and see, Europe has been a resounding success on this. Yes, there are lots of issues, and it has a very strong outer shell. No one in Europe is saying take away the external border, they're saying reinforce the external border. But we have 30 countries within. My own view is that it would be impractical and politically impossible to have a borderless world now. But as a goal, I think it's a good goal. And the analogy I have as an economist is with trade and free trade. A lot of people understand that free trade would be highly beneficial for many countries. Would lead to high economic growth, would lead to better outcomes and higher living standards. But they recognize that in the process, a lot of people are going to get very badly hurt. Their standards of living will drop, and that politically this will be not going to happen. So there's a progressive movement towards it through trade negotiations, through other policies that happen. And I think that we should be doing the same with migration. In other words, we should see this as an object to move towards and try and open our borders gradually, accept more people. What I recommend in the book is what I call a migration bargain. In other words, we should accept more people, but we should do so on the basis of rights and responsibilities. The rights are that these people should be treated fairly, should be subject to minimum wage, health and safety legislation, pension portability, etc. They should have the rights of citizens as well politically if they've stayed over a certain time. The responsibility is that they behave like citizens, that they are subject to the rule of law in all respects, that they abide by our cultural norms and practices that are legislated for. In other words, people can't have polygamous marriages or whatever. And that if they've come on a contract, that they leave when we have agreed that they will leave under their contract. So I think contractual labor is fine as long as it's a fair bargain between people in a legally open way, transparent way. The problem with this bargain is it raises a very big question, which is of documentation and identity. And that is a tricky issue in the UK. It's not in most countries. Most countries accept that everyone, including India now, should have an identification. But in the UK, we don't actually carry identification with us. And we're not asked for identification. And so part of my thinking in this is that we need to, if we want to have more migrants and we know who's in our society, we also need to be moving towards more transparent means of identification.
So tagging on to that, to bring in some of these other different angles that you developed so well in the book, thinking about documentary systems, for example, which, probably a lot of people aren't aware, but, of course we have these passports today, which we think of as allowing us to enter into different places depending on how good or bad our passport is, when historically it was actually exit was the tricky thing. You had to get permission not to enter, but permission to exit in the first place. So we've seen, and then as you cover in the book, the 19th century, especially thinking about the European space, there was this idea that these identity documents were becoming a thing of the past and wouldn't even be needed. If you're doing a transatlantic or a transoceanic voyage, very often whether you needed documents depended basically on your class of ticket. If you had a third class ticket, you had to show documents. If you're first class, you didn't have to. And then as you bring in the World War I and the surprising thing of all of a sudden people thought these documents would fade away, but instead the system becomes much more rigorous. And now we're in the system we have today, which is you need to have a passport, very often, or these identity documents across the border. But we're moving to the system of biometrics, when it's no longer necessarily your passport, that form of document, but who you are can be read from your eyes. Do you see that as transforming these systems and, forms of selection and even potentially classist, racist, or nationalist forms of selectivity or mobility control as well?
Clearly, the system is becoming more and more and more sophisticated. We already have facial recognition control in the CCTV cameras that I bring that. And we know that we're being watched. So to me, the question is, do you trust Big Brother? If you're in a democracy where you believe that the information about you, which is being gathered at increasing frequency, is going to be used to protect you and to safeguard your welfare and the societal welfare in a fair way, and you trust the system, that's fine. But you wouldn't want it if you didn't trust the system and if you thought it was going to be used to control you or manipulate you or blackmail you and other things. And so I don't think there's a general answer to the question. I think the answer is, what safeguards have you put in place to ensure that the information is used legitimately in a democracy? And if you're not in a democracy, what safeguards are there to ensure it doesn't control? I worry much more about it in a non-democracy than I do in a democracy. It's one of the reasons I believe very strongly in democracy. But we know that there's huge abuse in democracies as well. And so much stronger, I think, oversight, ability to understand how this data is used, what it's used for, and that it's being used for the purpose that we legislated for it to be used for, I think is absolutely essential.
So thinking about going back to what you're describing in terms of migration bargains, and it made me think a little bit about the UAE, which is of course brought up in the book. But United Arab Emirates is a country where 90% of the population is foreign. And what you were just describing in terms of a migration bargain sounded quite a lot like the way the UAE manages migration. You could come in on a work contract that's pretty much all private sector labor is being carried out by foreigners, different kinds of contracts, different kinds of agreements. It's not a democracy, it's an authoritarian regime, so you have to agree to the rules, otherwise the punishments can be quite harsh. But there's been the argument by Posner and Whale that it actually does more to reduce global inequality than foreign direct investment, because so many migrants are sending remittances home. Would you say that the UAE's model of migration is one that the UK might adopt or learn from?
So, Kristen, you've done a book which writes about these things, and I recommend Kristen's book on golden passports. I'm comfortable with the idea that we enter into contracts with people to work and expect them to leave at the end of the work. Not everyone is comfortable with that. that believe that somehow if you work, you have a right to settlement, or if you study, you have a right. I don't believe that. I think one can enter contracts. To me, the question specifically about the UAE is whether people are being treated fairly. Are they contract, and one hears bad stories about this. One hears about passports being confiscated. One hears about absolutely appalling conditions of residence. One became very aware, this is not the UAE, this is Qatar, of the number of people, was it a person a day or something, dying in the construction of the stadium for the football World Cup in Qatar. So to me, a part of the bargain is not only the contractual agreement on the amount of money, but the terms and conditions of employment, of residence, etc. Now, obviously, if you ask the people that are migrating to the UAE, and I've spent time in Dubai, UAE, everywhere you go, migrants are doing it, unskilled, skilled, etc. They obviously say we're here because we have to be here. We're supporting our families, and the whole economies of Kerala and villages in Pakistan and so on are supported by these migrant workers. Incidentally, those villages and places they come from, and this is sort of not the question you asked, but it's relevant, are wealthier than the rest of the place. In other words, there's not a brain drain, there's a brain gain. The levels of education, of health, of housing infrastructure, etc., are higher in areas where you have higher levels of out-migration. And that the reason is obvious, is that the migrants are sending back money to sustain at higher levels those places. There are exceptions when you have very high, particularly small island states, where you have very high levels of migrant population, but in large populations like in India and Pakistan, it's not the case. To me, the issue on UAE is about that, are people being treated fairly? And is it a transparent bargain? Are they free to leave when they want to leave? And how can one improve all those conditions and terms?
So in the UK, we have a new government after a very long time, a change of party in power. What would you recommend? And it's also interesting too, because the last time Labour was in power, it was the general public attitude towards international migration was more open than it has been recently. Given all these changes, given Brexit, given how politicized migration has become within the public space, but recognizing also the great economic importance of international migration as well, and you described this very well in the book. If you just look at the economics of it, it's the answer is a no-brainer. But from the politics, it's a much more complicated story. What would you advise the Labour government should do in terms of its migration policy?
Well, I wish they would listen to me, but they won't. The first thing which just horrified me is Keir Starmer going off to get advice from Meloni. I mean, what a stupid thing to do. She is the worst example of migration management in Europe. She sort of epitomizes it. She's advocating it. What she's tried to do with the offshoring to Albania of immigration is sort of their version of the Rwanda scheme, has already been struck down by the Italian courts, and we haven't even got to the European courts yet on it. And so it's a massive, like the Rwanda scheme, it's a massive waste of money. I think they've already spent something like £260 million equivalent building these things that won't be used. So that's not where to start. I think the answer is in migration bargain. I think it's in stopping conflating refugees and migrants. We need safe passage for refugees. We need to deal with refugees as a separate thing, create safe passage. The cost of these crazy schemes on refugees to house people in boats and things, something like £20,000 per person, is really beggars belief. Not allowing refugees to work is ridiculous. They want to work. We should get them to work. They can contribute. They can even pay their own rent, and then obviously invest heavily in the processing, so we don't have years of backlog of people basically locked up, getting more and more depressed on the public expense. So refugees are one thing. The answer is not what Keir Starmer has done, which is to appoint the former head, I think, of border police to smash the gangs. That's not how you're going to deal with refugees. You're not going to slow the refugees' numbers, and people find other routes. The gangs are there because we don't have safe passage for refugees. I also think, incidentally, that we should have higher aspirations than being number 20 in Europe in terms of our acceptance of refugees. That's just one thing. On economic migrants and students, I think we should double down on what the Tories wanted to do, which is increase foreign student numbers. It's been very successful. Our universities are great, and we should have more foreign students. And I'm comfortable with them cross-subsidizing domestic students as well. I think that's fine. Taxpayers are paying for domestic students. They're paying for much of the infrastructure, and I'm comfortable that foreign students pay a higher, therefore, cost because they are not being paid for by taxpayers of the UK. Incidentally, this also applies to the recruitment of nurses and doctors and other professionals from elsewhere. I think it's absolutely wrong that we are running our National Health Service and many professional services like engineering, accounting, and others in the UK based on the expenditures of taxpayers in other countries. You know, Malawi or South Africa or Nigeria pays for the training of a nurse or a doctor, and then they come and work here. And it's basically a South-North transfer. How does one deal with that? Is it the individual that should pay back the money? In other words, they should study with a loan and then pay it back if they leave the country under a certain number of times? Or is it the NHS that should pay for the cost of the training, or the British government? That's an interesting series of questions that need to be resolved. But that we are basically not paying for the capital formation of people, human capital, what economists call human capital, formation of people, and we're using them, I think is wrong. I don't think the answer is saying people shouldn't come here, though, because that is, I think, an infringement of human rights. But we should be able to say, if you're going to come here and you haven't paid back the cost, then you should pay it back. The broader question is that we should just have more migrants, both skilled and unskilled. We're going to need them. We've got a rapidly aging population. We have agriculture in the fields that's not being picked because we don't have enough seasonal labor. We have massive housing shortages. The restaurant next to our house in Oxford is closed because they can't recruit another chef, which is crazy. It closes a night a week. They can't, because the chef needs a night off. They really want another chef, but they can't get it because they can't get the visa. You know, and this is not atypical. You speak to hospitality industries across the UK, they're complaining about the shortage of people. It just doesn't make sense. So I think targeting some number is the wrong way to go. I think what we should say is we will meet the skills, and then the difficult question, which I don't have an easy answer for, is what's the balance between contractual work, skilled and unskilled, and residence? What's the pathway to residence? How many people can bring their partners or their families or their dependents? That's where it gets complicated. But I think some pathway to residence, some pathway for migrants to move from, you know, if you've been here for 5 years as an economic migrant, should you have the right to stay or not? Should you have the right to bring your family or not? Those are questions that we need to work through, and the answer is yes, but to what degree? So that's where I would head. I would head to having Keir Starmer to stop saying, let's keep them out, to start saying, how do we attract them? We're in a war on talent. We also want to have unskilled people. British workers do not want to work in an abattoir. They do not want to do all sorts of work. Let's accept them and welcome and celebrate the people from around the world that are prepared to do those jobs for us.
So that's the answer. Labour Party, if you're listening. But probably there's more questions, I'm guessing, from the audience. So I've got plenty I could keep going with, but I don't want to, in a sense, leave you all here in silence. So I'd like to open things up. If there's any questions for Ian. We've got the the history of the world and migration around the world. So anything's up for grabs.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. I'm French, so maybe you can hear. I'm also a migrant. I'm now in Oxford as well, just to as a visiting scholar. So it's very nice to be here and also to learn about different ways to work and in a different setting. So I can tell migration is very nice. I was thinking about this also the capitalistic system and migration and documents. So I basically live in Corsica, where a lot of fruits are being picking up during COVID. Planes had to come from Maghreb to bring migrants, which are normally undocumented. The thing with these people, which are basically running the agricultural system in Europe, is that they don't have rights really. They don't have labor rights, for example. So it's very easy for the system to have a very cheap labor, and then to have a cheap product from the agriculture. So do you think there is also something to do on this sort of labor rights market or economy? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. One of the great failures is in international governance of migrants. There is an international organization for migration now, which is now recognized by the UN, but it has no power. It's basically data. It's a very helpful, it's a very good organization, but it doesn't have the power to intervene. It doesn't have the power to ensure compliance with international human rights or other standards. And there are whole areas like, for example, pension portability, social security payment portability, which it has no power of at all. One of the things that happens is that migrants typically pay social security contributions and in the UK, national insurance contributions, even contribute towards pension funds, and then they leave. In the US, there's something like $1 trillion of unclaimed money in suspense accounts that migrants have contributed. That, and I talk about this in the book, that's not then claimed by them. And the same thing is happening. So my own view is that we need much more. It has to be, in the end, it's going to be international, I think. But there's no harm in countries in the European Union, of obviously which Corsica is a part, start setting the standards on these. And then it's a question of compliance with these standards. We need an inspectorate, for example, that goes around in agriculture and checks whether employers are doing it or not. We've had terrible tragedies in the UK. Many people might remember what happened to the Chinese cockleshell collectors that undocumented, that drowned here because they were left and the tide came up and many people drowned. The terrible things that happen to people, particularly undocumented people, hyper-exploited people, and I think that's part of one of the terrible bargains that happens, and it's particularly, I think, clear in the US at the moment. You have this political theater of basically kicking people out, and Trump is sort of at the height of his theater at the moment in terms of demonizing migrants. At the same time, the supporters often of this, the businesses and so on, are employing undocumented people, and often the individuals themselves are employing undocumented people in their homes, in their factories, in their farms, and elsewhere. And that's the worst of all worlds. not accepting migrants as necessary, is basically making them illicit in some way, and then taking away all the protections that citizens would have in the process. And that's, I think, something that one of the reasons to talk openly and to welcome migrants is so that you can give them the rights and responsibilities that workers in society have. Incidentally, this also addresses a lot of trade union concerns that feel that undocumented workers are undermining wages. They're not if people are paid the minimum wages.
Oh, it's my bag. Okay, the gentleman.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. There was a piece, I think 2006 or 2007, by Robert Putnam that you might have come across in your studies called E Pluribus Unum, looking at the effects of migration and diversity in particular on social capital in an American context. And the argument was basically made that in the short and medium term, social capital is actually eroded by migration and diversity. Even though it has long-term effects, we really need to, in the American context, need to make a better effort to like amalgamate and, you know, the melting pot idea, to make sure that those sort of short and medium term consequences of migration are mitigated. I'm curious if you think that that argument holds, or sort of what context of interpreting migration you think is the right one from a Western context, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's right to be concerned, to understand the concerns of people regarding the cultural, social norms that they feel are important, and that migrants might have different ones, and how this might reflect on the politics of migration. I mean, what's so striking in the UK, for example, and in Europe, is the very different way that we've treated Ukrainian refugees, for example, to Syrian refugees, or to refugees from Africa. And that's clearly based on all sorts of priors about similarities and differences with people that people have embedded in their heads. My own view is that these things should be talked about more openly. We need to establish what our tolerance is of different things, but also work very actively to overcome prejudice, racism, and other forms of discrimination, which are not based on anything other than fear and past, I think, ideas. One example of this is, for example, the different ways that different places are dealing with clothing. For example, the French banning the wearing of any religious signs in schools, and the hijab. That the UK has taken a different approach. I don't think one is right or wrong. I think these are things that societies need to work through and become comfortable as part of their process of bringing people into their societies. The question of whether one should have language training, for example, for migrants is an interesting one. The Japanese, for example, brought in 300,000 Indonesians, and for the first 6 months gave them all Japanese lessons as part of their contractual engagement with a group of people. I think that is also something that if the Japanese want to do it, and if it's part of the bargain, it seems to me to be perfect. What we find is that over time, of course, these things dissipate. Second, third generation immigrants are very different to their parents, and the societies end up being, as you said, melting pots. It's really this first generation questions that come. It's incidentally one of the side benefits of people not being assimilated is that they tend to be more entrepreneurial. So one of the reasons why you have a much higher share of immigrants starting things up is because they don't feel that they fit in to existing businesses, or they're not given jobs So they have to create the jobs themselves through their own small businesses. I'm not advocating, I don't think it's good, I think we should accept them. But the ability of migrants to then create anew is something which has also been very universal over time.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. It was really insightful. And there was one point that I felt I was wondering how parallel it works is when we look into financial history as well, we see in a way initially when currencies were still being developed that there were no borders when it came to currency as well because of the fact that we used pure silver or as much as possible pure silver and gold. So then when we return back to the same question of should we now be going back to a world where migration is something that is more common because of no borders, can we ask the same question when it comes to finance as well, that should we be going towards a universal currency as well? How parallel do you think these two things run?
I think it's an interesting question which I haven't really thought about, so I'll give you my immediate answer, but I might wake up thinking of a different one. I think they're very different. People and money is different. We do almost have a universal currency. The dollar is hyper-dominant. It accounts for something like 90% of global trade and settlement. And it's not getting any smaller. It's also hyper-dominant in terms of reserve currency or what currency countries are holding. It's, to me, a different sort of story. And of course, one can switch. The whole thing about currency is that it's tradable. So if you trade it into other currencies, people are not tradable. We are, I think, much less able to move because of all the stickiness, because of all the barriers that are put up. And the euro, in a sense, is the European equivalent of European free movement, but even the euro only applies to, I think, about half European countries, and is not a priority with Europe. So I'm struggling to see that they are similar.
Oh, hi, Professor Kirsten and Ian. Pleasure. Just a question regarding global warming. What are your views on concept of climate refugees or people who have to have a forced migration due to climate? And that's my question. Thank you very much.
I talked about this in the final section of the book. The final section of the book is sort of forward-looking, and obviously this question is one of the key questions of the future. You'll be familiar with the book that Guy Vance has written, where he suggests there could be well over a billion climate refugees. I think that is very unlikely. I think the category of climate refugees will clearly come into existence, people who cannot live where they are. But how one defines this is going to be the subject of much debate. Already a lot of people moving out of the fragile lands of the Sahel, for example, are moving because they cannot make ends meet in those places. The same is true around the Chad Basin. The same has been said of Syria and of other places. So there's a gradual erosion of the ability to live somewhere because your land becomes more and more fragile. The climate becomes more extreme, and of course, agriculture doesn't care about averages. Agriculture is all about extremes. 1 second of a hailstorm that's too big, a wind that's too strong, a temperature that's too high or too low, destroys your system. And so extreme volatility is really, I think, going to be the big driver of this flood, the drought, etc. I think it's a compounding factor. If you're rich enough, you can live in the desert. I mean, talk about Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Qatar, these are desert cities. There's no water, there's only desert. Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas in the US are other examples of places which are desert cities, and actually land values are increasing extremely rapidly and people are migrating to them, which says if you have enough money, you can live anywhere, certainly in the desert. The groups that I work with in Oxford suggest we'll have 3 to 5 meter ocean rise this century, plus all the tidal surges and other big events. That would place Mumbai, Shanghai, Lagos, Jakarta, Dakar, Miami underwater, or large parts of them underwater. The response of people will be to move to other places within their countries. But obviously, if you're the Maldives, is the highest point in the Maldives 3 meters or something? That's not an option. Certainly, I think it'll happen. I think it's a compounding factor, and in the end, it's going to depend on people's levels of income, the optionality within their country, and if they are refugees, they'll go to neighboring countries. I do not see what the scaremongers say, which is basically Africa is going to move to Europe. I think that fails to understand the nature of migration, the levels of poverty, etc. But it's also worries me because I worry about the weaponization of migration and refugees. I don't think we should be saying, let's act on climate change, because if we don't, we're going to be overwhelmed by migrants and refugees. And I think we should be acting on it because it is an existential threat for humanity in general, everywhere. But not that we're acting on it because we're scared of having more people come to our country.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I note a number of hands. Should I collect a few questions?
Sure. And they might be online as well.
Yeah, online it seems like we're okay, but I can collect a round of questions. So there's a woman in the back and a woman in the front. Couple more hands in the very back.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was curious about your opinions on the policy in the Philippines, where predominantly the economy there relies on remittances from people abroad, obviously putting people in quite a vulnerable position. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
So you've laid out some rational arguments about migration and why it might be beneficial. So why is it that it is such an emotive, sticky, hot button issue that is hijacked by the political parties? And why do people react to it with such gusto?
That's a nice way to describe it.
Thanks. That was very interesting. My question is, how do you think migration might interact with demographics going forward, with aging populations, massive undersaving for pensions, especially in Western Europe? Might we move to a kind of situation where there's actually massive demand for migrants and we move to competition for them rather than kind of anti-immigration sentiment? Thanks.
Yeah, my question also, first of all, thank you very much for the talk, but my question feeds into a similar direction. I think in Germany, there was recently a study saying we need on average a net inflow of 1 million, or not net inflow, but an inflow of more than 1.3 million migrants each year to cope with the aging of the population. And we see that the empirical evidence is quite clear on at least the medium and long-term positive effects of migration, but we still at the same time see this increasing negative sentiment. So there's a drift between the perception and the facts, and I feel like this is something we experience, especially in the last decades or in the last decade. There are other countries like Australia where there's a more like let's say practical approach, a pragmatic approach to migration. So what do you think? How can we turn this very negative perception and this negative trend in Europe?
Great. All right. Let me whiz through these questions, each of which I could spend. Sorry.
Easy one.
Easy ones, yeah. Where do you take them? I'll group the question on gusto and the disconnect between politics and economics together. But let me take the other two first. Philippines. I think the Philippines is a remarkable example of pretty effectively managed migration. They have a whole organization there which is monitoring the conditions of their citizens abroad. They have made a whole industry of the export of people, care workers, teachers, nurses, and others particularly. It typically tends to be one member of a family who's then sending remittances back to support other members. The families that people come from tend to be better off than those that don't have migrants. It's similar to other remittance stories. And interestingly enough, the overtraining of people for this has led to a higher ratios at home of care workers, teachers, and nurses to the population than in neighboring countries. In other words, the opposite of the brain drain leading to a deficit of people has led to a surplus of people. And it's often part of a life cycle that people go back home and then work after they've worked abroad in that. So I think it's a relatively good example. I'm not suggesting for a second that there aren't examples of abuse, that it's not terribly hard for the people that make these enormous sacrifices, often on behalf of their families and communities, in order to go. It's horrible in many respects, but it's people's choice, and they're doing it in order by making these sacrifices to help the others and that they're leaving behind often, and often to explore their own life choices. They want to live abroad for other reasons. So I actually think the Philippines is a relatively positive example, and I do talk about it in the book. The question on migration and demographics is a massive subject. Over half the countries now in the world below replacement level in terms of fertility, and rapidly aging, about 2 years a decade on average of populations. This means that labor forces are rapidly contracting in relation to the number of dependents on them. And as this rises, you've pointed to one implication, which is who's going to pay the pensions, but it's also who's going to sustain them physically, who's going to be pushing us around in our wheelchairs. And this is particularly acute because there's a disconnect between improvements in physical and mental life expectancy. In other words, physical life expectancy is improving about 2 years a decade, but there's virtually no progress in mental life expectancy in neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia. And they require intense levels of care. It's also, incidentally, no one's raised AI yet, but it's one of the areas where I don't think there'll be much progress in AI in terms of substituting for humans. Machines will do many, many things, but they will not look after, hopefully, elderly people or babies for the foreseeable future. And so the need for people will not be substituted for by machines, robots, I think, in this area. So demographics extremely significant. I think within the workforce, there's some areas, particularly in manufacturing, in some services where there will be substitution of machines for people, but there are many that there will not be. And so I agree with the hypothesis that I think the current conversations we're having about how to keep migrants out will be turned on their heads in 30 years' time. The workforce in Europe will be about a third smaller than it is without migrants. This is also true of other countries. China has 4 million less workers this year than last year. Japan, of course, they're ahead of the curve, as always. I know you've worked in Japan, Kristen. They were the first to automate. That's why they've been at the technology frontier, because of the demographics driving it. And now they are finally overcoming their resistance to migration, and the migrant numbers are going up quite rapidly in Japan. Incidentally, there's a long lag between the politics and the economics on this. The countries with the lowest fertility rate in Europe are the most anti-migrant. Okay, Hungary, Poland, Italy, lowest fertility rates and the most anti-migrant sentiment. So there's a lag, but it does happen. Okay, let's then go to the final set of questions, which is about this disconnect between the economics and politics. Why is anti-migrant sentiment rising when the evidence of the need is so compelling and the positive and beneficial effects? I think there are a number of factors at play here. The most significant one, I think, is the impact of the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, cutting public services and public investment and privatization of housing stock, which has led people to feel and perceive a real shortage of housing, unaffordable housing, of public transport, of health services and other services, and feel as if somehow there's a competition for these resources with other people. I think that is factor number one, is cuts in investment. Factor number two, I think, is the financial crisis compounded by COVID, the real sense of impact of foreign risks on our societies, and particularly these risks which devastated livelihoods. There are still parts of the UK economy and other economies, the US notably, where people's real wages are lower than they were in before the financial crisis. So massive parts of these economies have been devastated. And I think the association of foreign with risk is something that's hardwired increasingly into our minds. Financial crisis, COVID, climate change, all of these things are coming from somewhere else, and it's to do with foreign. And so we don't like the foreign part. I think this has been weaponized by populist and nationalist politicians, many of, incidentally, who are migrants themselves or second or third generation, including Nigel Farage, who was obviously, his forefathers were Huguenot refugees here. If they hadn't been accepted into the UK, Nigel Farage would not be in the UK, he would not be alive. So you often get this paradoxical thing where people who themselves are migrants. Elon Musk is another one. He's become anti-migrant. You know, he's obviously a migrant. He went to the same school as me in Pretoria.
Don't boast about that.
I'm not. But it's an example of people able to pull up the drawbridge after they've crossed it. But I think it's the sense of blaming others for problems. One of the tropes out there is that migrants are criminals, or all the evidence is that they're much less likely to be. I think one addresses it by, and this goes to your question about Augusto, I think it's explained by people's feelings of vulnerability, financial vulnerability, insecurity, etc. I think it's addressed by going on the front foot and actually talking as politicians of the benefits that migrants bring. I think we need to be very clear. If we're over a dinner table with people that say we hate migrants, we'll say, well, you shouldn't be eating your dinner tonight. The food has been cooked by migrants. The abattoirs in which the animals were killed in are staffed by migrants. The food was picked by migrants. So if you don't like migrants, don't eat. The housing sector question, houses are unaffordable, particularly in places where there is a strong economic growth, like London. But of course, construction costs will be much higher. We need more migrants to bring down the cost of construction in housing. Not if less migrants would mean much higher construction costs, much less house building possibility. And we've seen this, and we will see it if Trump gets elected in the US and he implements what he says he's going to implement, which is deporting people and stopping people coming in. There will be a financial crisis in the US, and he implements the tariff conditions he's talked about. One of the first places where we're going to feel this is massive increases in construction costs, because over half the construction workers in the US are undocumented migrants. So you kick them out and you damage your construction industry. So I think we need to address this. We need to have more information and more ability to talk about what migrants bring to our society, and less fear about them. But it's a real issue, and I don't think we've succeeded. I think those that are anti-immigrant are winning the argument. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And before I forget, I should tell you, is being sold outside, and I'm happy to sign and continue the conversation with you.
I must admit, if you thought that was an impressive overview of all the issues with migration going on in the world right now in 10 minutes flat, I do highly recommend the book, which is for sale, and Ian has said he'd be happy to sign it as well. So thanks very much for coming out, and hope to see you at the next event as well.